Hello everyone. I hope you had a wonderful morning. I have the pleasure and honor to introduce to you the Honorable Dennis Kwok. Dennis was elected in 2012 into the Legislative Council, representing the Legal Functional Constituency, succeeding Ms. Margaret Ng. At a very young age, he was the second youngest member to be elected that year. Dennis was also the co-founder of the Professional Commons, a founding member of the Civic Party, and also a member of the Citizen Commission for Constitutional Development, which was initiated by Mrs. Anson Chan, the former Chief Secretary for Administration. Without further ado, please join me to welcome the Honorable Dennis Kwok.
Thank you. Thank you so much for organizing this. I really say this, it's a real pleasure and privilege for Charles and I to be able to come here and to talk about Hong Kong. And as Larry put it yesterday, he said the last conference about Hong Kong in the East Coast was 1997. Was it Harvard or Yale?
Yale.
So it's really long overdue that we have another conference about Hong Kong to explore what is happening in Hong Kong and where Hong Kong will be in the 21st century. And as Charles said last night in his opening, it is good that we are a long way from home. It is good that there's a distance between us and Hong Kong, which will give us, hopefully, a better perspective on what's happening in Hong Kong and in the Greater China region, and what Hong Kong is doing, and what impact it will have in that region in the coming decades. I think it is good that we are here looking back from a distance. I've chosen the topic on one country, two systems, and the meaning of one country, two systems. I think it is important for us to remind ourselves what one country, two systems is about. It's been precisely 30 years since the Sino-British Joint Declaration was signed in 1984. Unlike Mr. Martin, I can't lie to you and say I remember exactly the moment when the declaration was signed. I was 6 at the time, so I don't remember anything about the signing of the Sino-British Joint Declaration. It has been 30 years, and I think it is good that we ask ourselves whether we are living up to the original purpose and intent of one country, two systems, and whether there is still any relevance and meaning to this concept of governance when it was first conceptualized and announced about 30 years ago through the Sino-British Joint Declaration. And what is it about today is a topic which I hope to explore with you. To me, one country, two systems has always been about one thing, and one thing only. It's about the preservation of our core values under our system, the Hong Kong system. And what are those core values? I could perhaps summarize it into 4 categories. Number 1, clean government. Clean government that will act with, that have public institutions that will act with integrity and accountability. So number 1, clean government. Number 2, freedom of expression and freedom of press. Number 3, free enterprises and the free market economy. And number 4, the rule of law. I would say those are the core values that we excel in Hong Kong, and those are the core values that we seek to preserve under one country, two systems. And for me, I've gone into politics precisely because I see the core values of Hong Kong as being very important. And there are many like me, Charles being one example, who see that core values in Hong Kong are perhaps under threat, that we cannot take the core values under one country, two systems for granted, that we have to go into politics because politics matters. It's not the only thing that matters in terms of preservation of core values, but it is important that we get into politics and assert what we see as important. So I would like to begin by looking at these 4 sets of core values and then seeing how we're doing in those 4 areas, and to see what kind of conclusion we can draw out of them. So number 1 is clean government. Clean government is always been an important core value for Hong Kong, and it is a very important factor in distinguishing us from the rest of the mainland China. Of course, clean government has not always been around in Hong Kong. It's always, Hong Kong is actually a pretty corrupt place prior to the establishment of the ICAC in the 70s. But clean government has become ingrained in Hong Kong people's core value, that it is something so fundamental to the city's existence and value that we come to see clean government as something that we have to preserve under one country, 2 systems. So how is it doing? As we speak, the former Chief Secretary, Raphael Hui, is under prosecution for corruption. His trial is coming up in May, I believe, and it is since 1842. It is probably the most high-profile corruption case involving the highest government official ever, and also 2 property tycoons. And so this case is to be watched with interest, because I remember precisely, I wasn't in politics back then, but when Raphael Hui, the former Chief Secretary, stepped down when he reached retirement age, he said this: he thinks that there's too much separation of powers in Hong Kong. He said that there's too much check and balances, that the Pandemocrats overstepped the mark in check and balance. That's what he said at the time, and I always remember that phrase. And looking back, was there really too much check and balance? Was there really too much separation of powers in Hong Kong, that the executives cannot do anything because they're always being watched? So you can draw that conclusion yourself. And of course, the case is still underway. The prosecution is still to be undertaken in 2 months' time. And another case which is of interest in terms of clean government is the investigation that is going on in relation to the former ICAC Commissioner, Mr. Timothy Tong. Some of you may have heard about this investigation, but essentially it involves Mr. Tong's conduct and behavior whilst he was the commissioner of the ICAC in the past 5 years. And allegations against him is that he has been too cozy with mainland officials, especially in the drinking department. His bar tab ran up to 5 times that of the former, his predecessor in the ICAC, especially in the Chinese beverage called Mao Tai, which I hate, but he loves. And he's been drinking slightly too much of that with Chinese officials. And in LL.B, we discover there are complaints about his conduct. And so in LL.B, we raised certain inquiries about his expenses and his foreign travels, especially in mainland China. And that's how the whole thing was uncovered. There's since been a government report and a Public Accounts Committee report on his misconduct. And his conduct in office is now formally under investigation by the ICAC for offenses which are not yet known. So I will not comment any further because LL.B is still investigating this case. So those are the 2 cases which I would highlight when it comes to clean government in Hong Kong. Do we still have clean government? I believe so. I believe 95% or 99% of our public officials and public institutions do act with accountability and integrity when it comes to dealing with public affairs and making public decisions. And we have all the basic building blocks that is, I think, required in a civilized, modern society when it comes to check and balances. We have the directive audit, which is guaranteed under the basic law. We have the ombudsman. We have the legislative council. We have the ICAC, despite what Mr. Tong had done during his office. We have the ICAC. So we have all these public institutions that are there to check executive power. And largely, they do work well. They do keep the executive powers in check, and including police power. So I think Hong Kong still can hold its head high when it comes to talking about clean government. But as you all know, clean government is not something that we take for granted. It took decades for Hong Kong to build up its reputation from a essentially corrupt, very corrupt city to what it is now. But it will only take moments or the acts of several officials to damage that reputation. So you can judge for yourself whether the cases concerning Raphael Hui or Timothy Tong are isolated cases or part of a bigger systematic problem. This is something that we could discuss. Number two, freedom of press, freedom of expression. How are we doing? If you ask a Hong Kong government official, he or she will tell you that we have over 100 newspapers in Hong Kong. You can publish and print everything you want, be critical of government or even Beijing. So there is freedom of the press, true, part of the picture. As some of you mentioned this morning, the chief editor of Ming Pao was brutally attacked about a month ago by two knife-men. Our thoughts and prayers are with Mr. Lau and his family. Some say that we have no evidence to directly link it to his work as a journalist, as an editor of Ming Pao. Fine, we don't. But having known Mr. Lau for many years, I know how dedicated he is to his work as a journalist, as a political editor for a very important, perhaps the most important newspaper in Hong Kong. I know what he has to put up with, the pressure that he's been up to prior to the attack. So you can look at Mr. Lau's attack as an isolated incident, or you can look at Mr. Lau's attack in the wider picture. And what is the wider picture? You see what's happening with Apple Daily and AM 730. AM Sasami is one of the most popular free newspapers in Hong Kong. And Apple Daily, of course, you all know what Apple's stance is in relation to public affairs. There's been systematic withdrawal of advertising by large corporations. And the rumor is that they've been told to withdraw their advertising for those two newspapers in order to damage their revenue. That's another thing. Another popular radio host on public affairs, Ms. Li Wailing, she was a host of a very popular commercial radio program in the morning. Has been so for the past 3 to 5 years. And prior to that, an evening program, also on public affairs. So she perhaps people would call her the #1 radio host on public affairs. About 2 months ago, she was sacked by the commercial radio. And people link that to commercial radio's upcoming license renewal application. Again, there's never direct open evidence about these links, but you can draw your own conclusion with all these things happening. Mr. Lau's attack, the withdrawal of commercials advertising in Apple Daily and AM 730, the sacking of Ms. Li Wailing, and also the editor, the political editor of another really important newspaper, the Hong Kong Economic Journal, Symbol, was also replaced 2 months ago. So all these things are happening. Are we confident that the freedom of expression and the freedom of press can survive under these circumstances? Or are we confident that these are only isolated cases? I'm not so optimistic myself. I'm concerned that as I see these series of events happening, that there is perhaps a systematic attempt in trying to curtail free speech in Hong Kong or the freedom of press in Hong Kong. That if you dare to say anything that really annoys the government, and especially Central People's Government, then you have to pay a price. But they know that, of course, Hong Kong people are extremely resourceful. If you take away Ming Pao or Hong Kong EJ, so what? I'll go online and I'll find dozens of websites which are just as informative, just as critical, and there are several that are doing really well. One of them is called Xuchang Sanman, House News. And especially if you're abroad, you don't have access to a hard copy newspaper, and House News is really one of the very informative sites. But no, they can't curtail 100% of freedom of expression in Hong Kong or free press as they do in mainland China. But they are trying, and they're not giving up on trying to win the public's battle in the mainstream media. And I think we have to be careful of that. Number 3, freedom of enterprise, free market economy. Now, the Heritage Foundation would rank Hong Kong as the freest economy in the world, year after year, one of the freest. Yes, it's true. Hong Kong still has a free market economy. The free enterprise is still very much intact, as promised under the Basic Law. But how's it doing today compared to before the handover? Recently, as Charles mentioned yesterday, that there's been the free TV license episode that you all know, that Hong Kong Television bid to apply for the free TV license was rejected by the government. Now, before, free enterprise in Hong Kong meant that as long as you are a tax-paying, law-abiding businessman or enterprise, that you fulfill the minimum qualifications or requirements of a business, then government and politics will get out of the way of you doing business. You doing business is fine, and government and politics will leave you alone. But from what we've seen in this free TV license application, that politics has really gotten in the way of a genuine commercial enterprise. This commercial enterprise has invested billions of dollars into hoping to build a competitor in the otherwise quite a stagnant TV industry in Hong Kong, but was met with bureaucratic obstacle, to say the least, one after another. So why is it the case? Of course, a TV, especially a free TV station, is extremely influential, and they have said they will have a regular news program every day. And free TVs are not only watched by Hong Kong people, they are watched by another 1 billion people in Guangdong province every day, whether through Fancheng or whether through other means, they do watch Hong Kong TV. So of course, some say that they are concerned that this new Hong Kong TV station is going to threaten stability in mainland China or in Hong Kong. This is yet another example. If this is true, this is another example where Hong Kong people want genuinely just another free TV station, whereas because of wider national concerns or political concerns, that has derailed that very basic demands that Hong Kong people has. So is that going to be a trend that will continue? We're yet to see. But this is something that we must pay attention to. And last of all is the 4th set of core values, the rule of law, something that is very close to my heart, being a representative of the legal profession, obviously. The rule of law is what people say the last line of defense in Hong Kong, and for one country, two systems. Recently, we've seen a rise in the number of judicial review cases challenging government and executive decisions on all levels, from environmental issues to social policy issues. You've seen that people are more and more distrustful of government actions, and they are taking government decisions to the courts for what they call justice. But of course, the courts have only a limited power to do justice in judicial review cases. They are not to review the correctness of government decisions, but rather they are there to uphold the law, to ensure that the government follows legal reasoning and proper legal applications of principles when making decisions. But judicial reviews is rising, and I'm proud to say that the judiciary in Hong Kong is still fiercely independent. There's no question about that. You speak to judges on all levels, from the magistrate level to all the way to the Court of Final Appeal. Judges are trained with the tradition to think independently. They don't have a political or Politburo member sitting behind a desk telling them how to rule cases. No, that doesn't happen in Hong Kong. The judiciary, members of the judiciary are selected through an independent and a very credible appointment system based on their judicial merits. And for judges that go to the High Court or the Court of Appeal, they are selected from amongst the best in the legal profession in Hong Kong. So, coupled with the Court of Final Appeal system of having non-permanent judges from around the common law jurisdictions to sit in the Hong Kong Court of Final Appeal, we have Lord Hoffman, Lord Walker, Sir Gamal, top jurists from Australia, Canada, the list goes on, that will regularly come to sit in the Court of Final Appeal and to hear cases, and a lot of the time writing the majority judgment, the leading judgment for cases. So the judiciary is naturally seen by the Hong Kong people as the last line of defense. And of course, if the courts are independent and the courts are doing what they're supposed to do, it goes a long way to defend the freedom of expression and freedom of press and the basic law. So looking at those four sets of core values, how are we doing? Perhaps you would say that I'm painting a slightly more gloomy picture of Hong Kong. I'm sure some back home would be critical of me for saying all these bad things they say about Hong Kong, and that Hong Kong is really doing fine, one country, two systems is working, everything is hunky-dory. But I think we need to wake up to the fact that we live in a country where those in power do not necessarily accept or respect those core values that we talked about just now. Most Hong Kong people, 99% of Hong Kong people, would agree and treasure those core values that we just talked about. But it is not the case, especially in the mainland. That this is people in power in the mainland government do not respect or understand that these are accepted fundamental societal values everywhere around the world. That in civilized countries or societies, these are accepted core values, but it is not the case, and we don't live in such a country. So we do have to be concerned about, we do have to be vigilant about these core values. I do hope that my critics are right, that my concerns and worries are overblown. There's nothing to worry about. Really, everything's fine. If that's the case, that's great. I don't have to be in politics. I go back to my profession as a lawyer. But it is not the case. I don't think we should take these core values, if anything, for granted. And comparatively, of course, if you look at these core values, as David pointed out in his paper, that these are the areas where Hong Kong really excel still compared to the rest of mainland China. Clean government, in China, I don't think so. If you look at I remember about 5-10 years ago, you still hear the so-called patriots or loyalists, Beijing loyalists, to say to me, oh, you say too much about corruption in China. There's corruption everywhere. There's corruption in the United States. It's just a matter of degree. Those people are doing the country a disservice by making those statements. Corruption is rampant. Corruption is bringing the country down. It is that serious, and that's why Xi Jinping, after he took office, put corruption, tackling corruption at the very top of his agenda, taking down people like people who were former Politburo members. Apparently, Premier Wen himself are also under investigation. So corruption is a serious issue, and the Communist Party knows it. In contrast, Hong Kong has a relatively or absolutely clean government. 99% of the public officials or public institutions do behave clean and abide by the rule of law. Freedom of press, I don't need to say much about the freedom of press situation in China. Perhaps it's a little bit better in the southern parts of China, in Guangdong, with publications like the Southern Weekly or the Southern Weekend and others publications near Shenzhen and Guangzhou. But generally speaking, freedom of press do not exist in China. but it does in Hong Kong. And the internet is not controlled in Hong Kong, but it is in China. The rule of law, there is no rule of law in China. I would go as far as saying that. The rule by law may be that those in power see the law as a tool or as a mean to serve those in power, not to restrain those in power. And that's the fundamental difference. And through my practice as a lawyer, even though I practice law in Hong Kong, we come across cases that has a mainland element all the time. I remember the first case that I took on after I qualified as a lawyer was helping a businessman in Shenzhen. He happens to be a Hong Kong resident. He owns a huge business in Shenzhen at the time. And the Shenzhen government wants a piece of the action. He wants them to give him part of the company. He refused to play ball. He upset a few Shenzhen government officials. One night he was gambling in Macau. A group of PLA officials, not in uniforms, went into his room, took him, arrested him, took him across the border to Zhuhai, and put him in prison for 6 years. And then after appeal, because he happens to have an Australian passport, so after appeals by the Australian Prime Minister to Premier, it was Zhurongzi at the time, that he was finally released after 6 years, but his business taken away from him. And he was trying to seek justice in Hong Kong, and I was one of the lawyers helping out. But that was one of the first cases that I took on. Recently, there's always been cases that I do that involves mainland court systems. And I can say first-hand experience is that it does not fare well compared to what we expect of court systems in civilized countries around the world, especially in Hong Kong. And this is something that we have to get our heads around. And unless and until the Communist Party accept the concept of separation of powers, at least accept the concept and the need of an independent judiciary where judges make decisions based on the law alone, that there cannot be a true rule of law in China, far from it. So this is an area that we watch out. And free enterprise, lastly. Mainland China, free enterprise. If you've done business in China, you know that government officials do not get out of the way. In fact, they do the exact opposite from getting out of the way. A lot of the times, they do actively interfere and inject themselves into business and commercial enterprises. And I think we all know the situations that I talked about. And that is precisely why I say that one country, two systems is essential, not only for Hong Kong's survival, but for the rest of the country. Because you remember that one country, two systems, when it was first proposed by Deng Xiaoping, it was designed to be a proposal which they will offer to Taiwan, to our brothers and sisters in Taiwan, to say, look, how about this model? We'll test it in Hong Kong. If you like it, you can also have one country, two systems as part of the reunification plan. But I don't think anyone in Taiwan here, I don't think anyone in Taiwan would really take one country, two systems very seriously as part of the reunification plan. So the original, you can say that the original purpose of one country, two systems has failed utterly. But does one country, two systems still have any relevance in Hong Kong? I say immensely. Not only to protect our core values, but to ensure that these core values survive and are preserved in Hong Kong, so that hopefully one day when the country, I'm talking about the rest of the nation, is ready to change, that these core values will shine in the rest of the nation. To me, that is the meaning of one country, two systems today, that we have to fight for the survival of the system and the core values so that they could work for the betterment of our nation's progress in the 21st century. And it is that important that we try to preserve what we have in one country, two systems, hopefully to bring it to a constructive and fruitful end hopefully by the end of our lifetime. We would see that these values that we fight to protect in Hong Kong will be implemented in the rest of the country. And that's why, to me, one country, two systems is too important to fail. Hong Kong is too important to fail. You know, there are people who say that, oh, you know, we've really come to an end Hong Kong is doomed to failure. One country, two system is reduced to nothing but a slogan. I don't think so. I don't buy into that. I don't. Because if you analyze it, Hong Kong is unique because those core values are still intact. A lot of you would, after your graduation, would want to go back to work in Hong Kong, hopefully. And you would want to work and live in Hong Kong that is a place that treasures these core values, that practices these core values. Otherwise, Hong Kong will lose its meaning and its uniqueness. And also, looking at the broader sort of historic perspective, I've always reminded myself that Hong Kong and the rest of the Guangdong region has always, if you look back in the past 200-300 years of modern Chinese history, it's always been a place of change, the catalyst for change. We are, if you're Cantonese, put up your hand. Yeah. You remember, you are the descendants of reformers and revolutionaries for generations. People like Hong Yao-wai, Lam Kai-chiu, Dr. Sun Yat-sen, they're all from Guangdong. They are all proud members of the Cantonese clan. You are, and you have that legacy in you that I'm not telling you to be revolutionaries, don't make no mistake, but reformers. But reformers are what is needed in our country right now. And reformers do always come from Guangdong. And I don't know why, maybe perhaps we're closer to thinkings or philosophies from other regions in the world. Perhaps that's the case. Maybe it's in our blood that we don't like taking orders from Northerners. But that is the legacy that we all inherited. And now it's taking the form of one country, two systems. That is now taking the form in today's historic perspective. Hong Kong has an opportunity to make a difference. And earlier, I like Mr. Martin's description of Hong Kong, that it's like a phoenix, that every few decades we change. It's yet to be seen what Hong Kong will change into in the next few decades. I remain confident that Hong Kong will, yet again, survive this challenge that we have. And the way to do so is through one thing, is democratic reform. And that is why democratic reform is so important. Because as I said, the rest of the country are not are not really into the core values that we treasure in Hong Kong. Maybe the people are, but certainly people in power are not yet. So for Hong Kong people to take charge of its own destiny, we need to have a system where our will, the will of the Hong Kong people can shine through an electoral system that would allow the will of the Hong Kong people to come through. And the only way to do it is to fight for democracy. And that is why democracy is important. Because if the Hong Kong people do not have a say in our system of government, in the way things are run, in the way public affairs are decided, eventually these core values that we discussed will be eroded. It will be. But it is not too late. We still have the opportunity to fight for a genuine democratic election. As Charles put it yesterday, look, what is true democracy? It's no rocket science. It's one man, one vote, or one person, one vote, each vote being equal. And the right to stand for election is not unduly restricted. That the system will give the Hong Kong people a genuine choice when it comes to election. It's that simple. And of course, Beijing, or the pro-establishment camp, is trying to squeeze the nomination system so much that people they don't like will not be able to stand for election. And that's not democracy. And that's not going to give Hong Kong people a genuine choice when it comes to election. And that is not something we can accept. People say, oh, look, let's have the right to vote first, and then we'll think about it later. What's the point of having the right to vote if people cannot freely stand for election? People have the right to vote in North Korea, but the only candidate is always Kim Jong-un. Hong Kong is, of course, far from North Korea. It's not the right analogy. But what is the point of having the right to vote if you don't have a genuine choice? I've been told that I have half an hour to speak, but what I really want is to have questions from you in a sort of more interactive way, because it's not every day that we get to have these occasions where we are so far away from home that we're not bogged down by everyday political shenanigans, that we can really take a wider perspective and look at Hong Kong and Greater China region to see what we can do for Hong Kong, what we can do for one country, two systems, because it's too important to fail. We cannot allow it. So thank you very much for inviting me, and I look forward to the rest of the day and your questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you for that wonderful talk, and I think you gave a really great prognosis of what's going on in Hong Kong right now, and I would probably say also an inspirational talk too. There's microphones on both sides. Please queue up and identify yourself and ask away, I guess.
What's that?
Hello? Yeah, I'll use this.
Right. Hi. My name is Margaret Ng. I'm a faculty at Northeastern University. And it's a fascinating talk, but what keeps on coming through my mind is, what is the motivation of the Chinese government to maintain Hong Kong as a one country, two system? Because my understanding of the value of Hong Kong to the mainland government was, one, as an economic power, but now you've got Shanghai competing with Hong Kong, and two, that it could be a good example, a political example of Taiwan. And you've said yourself that that ceases to be an important consideration for mainland China. So,
What was the motivation?
yeah, for the Chinese government right now. And whether you see the rise of Shanghai affecting the relationship between Hong Kong and mainland.
I think you're right in saying that there is probably, can you hear? Or should I go back to this? It's fine, probably easy. I think you're right that there is no obvious motivation on the part of the Central People's Government to maintain the way Hong Kong is. I think Professor Hong, is Professor Hong still here? That he said that the strategy has always been that when they take over a new region, that they will give it autonomy for the first decade or two, and then they will slowly infiltrate and take it over. I think that may be the strategy that they have in mind. So we can't depend on the Central People's Government to allow Hong Kong to survive. We've got to fight for it ourselves. There's no other way. Because every time someone says to me that you enjoy these freedoms under the basic law, or in Hong Kong, freedom of press, freedom of expression, the fact that I can come to this conference without interference is something that's given to you by the Central People's Government. And I say BS to that. We enjoy the rights and freedoms in Hong Kong because we believe, as part of our system, that we are born with it, that these rights and freedom are ingrained in our culture and way of life. We don't need people to give it to us. What we need is a constitution and courts that will defend those rights. And same to your answer, what is there for mainland China or Central People's Government? Is there any incentive for them to keep Hong Kong the way it is? No, there isn't any obvious incentive for them to keep Hong Kong the way it is. That's why the Hong Kong people need to stand up and fight for the system themselves. Now, in a cynical way of answering your question, some mainland officials have habitually, or rich people in mainland, nowadays use Hong Kong as a private wealth bank. And they like to keep their assets and monies in Hong Kong because they know it's safe. There's a saying that unless your money is left mainland China, it's not really yours. And that's why they come to Hong Kong and they put their money here in either private wealth management or they buy houses or other assets that will maintain their wealth and use it as a base to go to the United States or other countries. But that's a very cynical way of looking at it. That's only a short-term incentive for some in mainland to see Hong Kong as an escape route. But the Hong Kong people need to realize that unless we stand firm to defend our core values and defend one country, two systems, it may be completely eroded in 10 to 15 years' time, and will not be a place that I want to live. Yes?
Hi, I'm Ben. So I got a few things. You said that democracy reform is the only way to preserve these core values, but first thing is it? Democracy, in my opinion, really does not promise anything at all. It's just a way of doing something. And I also kind of disagree with the view that democracy is not rocket science. I guess if you really look into democracy and its history and studies, you'll see how deep a rabbit hole it goes into, how much philosophy it has, like how to represent a person. And so like the deepness of democracy, I think, really matters in whether it would be able to protect our core values. So kind of the question is, I really wonder whether your views on core values is universal in Hong Kong. Perhaps you're missing some important things like stability or income, roof over your head, and maybe people, the majority actually value those more than anything else, like their freedom enterprise, for example. So would you mind, I don't know, answering maybe say how much of people would value a stable economy rather than, let's say, freedom of enterprise?
But why are the two things necessarily exclusive of one another? Why is stability and a roof over our head and a shelter has to come at the expense of our core values? Why can't the two be actually complementary of each other? And they are complementary of each other. And I would say that Hong Kong's success are built on those core values. Without clean government, without free enterprise, without the freedom of expression and the rule of law, we will not be the international financial center that we are today. So why is it that some people pitch the two against each other instead of seeing the two working together? You know, when I ran for election for the legal sector, that was exactly the kind of questions that my opponent threw at me, because my opponent is sort of seen as the more pro-establishment candidate. And the usual line they take is that, look, all you care about is these wishy-washy core values, freedom, democracy, but we care about our making a living and you know, feeding our family. But why are the two naturally opposed to each other, is my answer. I work very hard for the legal profession's interests in my capacity as the Legislative Council member. I do see making a living and stability is important, but it cannot come at the expense of core values, because at the end of the day we'll be kidding ourselves to say that we can ignore core values and pretend to make a living. Let me give you another example. The rule of law is, I think, universal in Hong Kong. If someone say, I don't believe in the rule of law, I think he's from another planet. At least not in Hong Kong. I don't hear people say the rule of law is not something that we need. But the rule of law cannot exist in isolation. The courts only have they can only make rulings in courtrooms, and their rulings can be ignored by public institutions and the government if they are not respected. There is nothing the courts can do. And if there is no freedom of expression, or if there is no freedom of movement, of association, of all the basic freedoms that we expect in a civilized society, the rule of law is meaningless. It doesn't matter if we have an independent judiciary or an independent legal profession. It will not work. So the rule of law, if you accept, does not live or does not survive in isolation. Then we need to keep all the basic building blocks of core values intact in order to protect what we have. So again, we need to see the picture as a whole. Every little bit of the piece of the jigsaw puzzle is as important to maintaining what we know Hong Kong to be, what we understand Hong Kong will be. And your comment on democracy, of course, I would hate to simplify what the democratic process is like. Democracy is meant to be messy. It will be messy. But if you look at Taiwan, as Professor Wu mentioned earlier, Taiwan is a case in point. whereby they introduced about universal suffrage about 10, 15, 20 years ago. And you see the gradual process. You know, you see the Taiwanese parliament, people are fighting, you know, dropping ballot boxes on each other's head. And then the vote rigging, and then the gunshot wound. But gradually, if you go to Taiwan, you sense this slow, mature process of democratic involvement from the bottom up to a sort of more mature civil society that you see that is building up in Taiwan. In Hong Kong, we have a very mature, we have all the basic building blocks for democracy to work. We have sensible finance campaign laws, and I dare say more sensible than the United States. We don't have gerrymandering in Hong Kong. We have very robust civil society, as you heard this morning. People are not afraid to express their views, not necessarily through political parties. Actually, there's a deep distrust of political parties in Hong Kong, which I think is a good thing for democracy. People shouldn't just take what politicians or political parties tell them as the cardinal truth. They should find out themselves. And Hong Kong people are extremely resourceful to finding out what they think is right. And we have a clean government. Officials are clean. We have the ICAC, the Director of Audit, the Ombudsman, the separation of powers, the independent judiciary. Judges are selected on their merits. They're not elected or they're not selected by government officials. So we have all the basic building blocks to make democracy work. The question is, do we take that final step of getting there and giving people the right to vote and the right to stand for election? I believe if you do that, you would see positive results rather than what we fear sometimes democracy would bring. Sorry, you have a follow-up.
Yeah. I just want to I'm really pleased that I'm hearing this from you. I just want to add on. How do you then link this democracy to vanguarding our core values? And if you said, like, we have built this liberal society, very liberal society, without democracy, what then, of course, you said one country, two systems, and what then now prevents us from continuously doing that? And as you said, one of the best systems you say was the judiciary system, which is not democratic. So, it's how do you see democracy tying into this kind of...
To the defending of core values. I believe in one thing, that the core values that we talked about, that exist under one country, two systems, are mostly what Hong Kong people want to see. You see that in the past 15 or 20 years of election results, the Democrats consistently got 60% of the vote. Now, I think they could do better. Through their own mistakes, I think they have committed many throughout the years. And that's why sometimes Hong Kong people turn their backs on the Democrats, and rightly so. They've made mistakes along the way. But generally, you see that even though the money, the power is on the side of the Beijing camp, but the Democrats have been able to survive. And if you ask Hong Kong people, do they believe in these core values? I think the answer mostly would be yes, they do. So in order for that will of the Hong Kong people to come through the system, we need an electoral process that will allow those will of the Hong Kong people to come through. Now the free TV license is another example. Most people in Hong Kong, 90%, believe that there should be a free license granted to the Hong Kong television. But the reason why it's not so is because the officials who make those decisions, especially our chief executive, is not accountable to the Hong Kong people. And that is a stark case, a stark example in point, whereby the chief executive that is elected or appointed by Beijing will ultimately, when push comes to shove, not listen to the will of the Hong Kong people, not respect the Hong Kong people, but listen rather to the views or opinions of the Central People's Government. And when it comes to critical junctures like Article 23 legislation, when it comes to issues concerning core values in Hong Kong like freedom of expression, free enterprise, we need a government that will stand on the side of the Hong Kong people when it comes to these junctures and not succumb to pressure from the North. And that's why I believe the two are linked, because politicians will ultimately have to look where their power is coming from. And they will make that judgment call themselves. Thank you for your question.
Thanks so much.
Anyone else? Yes?
Just now you said the Chinese government has lost its motivation to have to allow Hong Kong to have democracy. So if that's being said, what still keeps you fighting for democracy in Hong Kong?
You know, some people say that Hong Kong's epitaph is to Taiwan, don't be like us. Don't take one country, two systems. You know, as I said in my speech, I don't believe that. Right? I think that's a too fatalistic view of Hong Kong. Hong Kong has this amazing ability to reinvent itself, even at times that are most difficult. If you look back in the 60s, of course, I wasn't born then, but if you look back in the 60s, times in Hong Kong were much rougher than it is now. People were worried about occupied Central. I said, come on. You know, people were throwing bombs back in the 60s. And people, you still remember the assassination of London by car bombs? You know, all these things are happening. And the British colonial government was far from fair to the Hong Kong people in this treatment. But we survived. You know, we went through tough times. We came out winners. And anyone who's bet against Hong Kong in the past 50 years has all come out losers. People who left in '67, people who stayed in Hong Kong became the tycoons who bought up all the properties when it was rock bottom. People who left because of the handover, or in the 80s, they're afraid that the communists are going to take over. People who stayed became winners. They don't bet against Hong Kong. And even in SARS, during the Asian financial crisis, people who left regretted it because people who stayed are the ones who bought the properties. They came out the winners. So, you know, I would look back in Hong Kong's history and say to you, don't bet against Hong Kong. If you have a chance to go back to work in Hong Kong and live there and you know, make a stand for yourself, make a living yourself, do take that opportunity. I think what you see, especially in the 21st century, is the center of international affairs are shifting across the Pacific. And if you're Chinese, if you have a chance to work and live in Hong Kong and Greater China region, do take that opportunity. And that is what gives me the optimism about Hong Kong. I believe ultimately we will get there because the Hong Kong people are survivors and they will, and I believe they can take on this challenge, especially if we are to have faith in fighting that. And I think it's important for young people to really believe in that and not be too fatalistic about our future and otherwise prospects. To run for Legal, people have to give up their nationality. I gave up my Canadian passport, so please don't tell me that you have no faith left in Hong Kong. Otherwise, you know, my wife's going to blame me for giving up my Canadian. Yeah. Anyway, yes. Thank you for your question. Yes.
So this is a more abstract question, perhaps, but what do you see as the future of the one country, two systems model after the 50 years of no change is over? Because as our first question pointed out,
yeah,
the Chinese government really doesn't have much of an incentive or a reason to keep, to allow Hong Kong to have, you know, its little piece of sovereignty within the greater context of Chinese sovereignty. So what do you see as happening? Do you think that the press freedom that seems to be decreasing in Hong Kong is a sign that the Chinese government wants to start assimilating Hong Kong into the greater system? Or are you optimistic about the future, that we're going to be able to keep Hong Kong as we know it today?
Yes, you mentioned the 50-year period where supposedly things will remain unchanged as they are. But of course we know that things never remain unchanged. Things always change. But are they to change beyond our recognition, or are the core values that we talked about this morning are to remain in place? I see that the Honorable Andrew Lee, the former Chief Judge of the Court of Final Appeal, wrote a message in our conference this weekend. He said that it is important, especially for the younger generation, to understand the role that you will play. Because in 10 to 15 years' time, you will be the ones, or we will be the ones, that will be negotiating with the Central People's Government over the arrangement of Hong Kong beyond 2046. We will be the generation who will have to take on that task. And in order to arm ourselves with the ability to negotiate, we need to have a democratic mandate from the Hong Kong people to say that we want a continuation of one country, two systems, and our core values, and everything that is unique and special to Hong Kong. And to do so, you need the Hong Kong people to be standing behind you. And that's why we need an electoral system that will be able to give our government and those in power a mandate to say to the Central People's Government, this is what we want. If we don't have a democratic system in place by 2022, now I will not put it as later than that. If we don't have a democratic system of government in place by 2022, that will affect Hong Kong's survival and our ability to negotiate for an extension of one country, two systems beyond 2046. Because that negotiation will have to come in about 10 years' time. And by that time, we will be the ones who will have to do that job. And I hope we will have the mandate of the Hong Kong people to do so. Am I overly, as I said, you asked, as like other students, you asked how optimistic I am. My optimism rests on the core values that I talk about, that our ability, hopefully, to have a democratic system of government. If we secure those building blocks, so to speak, I'm confident that one country, two systems will survive, and that you guys will come and work in Hong Kong and make that your place to raise a family and enjoy the way of life that we've always enjoyed, our parents have. And I believe we can do that, but we need a few obstacles. We need to deal with a few obstacles on the way. Thank you.
I have a question about, actually two questions. First one, do you think the Chinese government is more lenient towards democracy and a true universal suffrage this time, just like the 23rd article, or is it's best to stop the true democratic process? And if so, the second question is, what price are you ready to pay, or what price is your party, Democratic Party, going to pay to bargain for Hong Kong?
You asked whether the Central People's Government really would give democracy. Is that your question? Your first part of your question?
My first part of the question was about, do you think the central government, Chinese government, is trying its best to stop Hong Kong from having a truly democratic process?
I think they realize that they cannot keep this democratic reform at bay forever. They've already pushed it back by 10 years from the original plan. The original plan, when the Basic Law was first drafted, was for there to be universal suffrage by 2007, 2008. That was the original plan, 10 years after Hanover, that the Hong Kong people would decide through a referendum to decide whether there will be a democracy in Hong Kong. Now, that plan was completely derailed now, that we are 10 years behind, and we're still not certain whether we'll get it in 2017. So you asked whether they are willing to give it to Hong Kong people. Yes, but with extreme reluctance, because they are not the people who came to political power through the democratic system. So fundamentally, this is not something that they see as part of their value. They see this as something that you Hong Kongers want, and we see it very differently. And that's why they say giving people the right to vote is already good enough, as long as we get to choose the candidates. But we say, hang on a minute, no, we want to have a choice in candidates as well, because that's how it should be. So I think that this is where we are at the moment on the question of democratic reform. On the price that we're willing to pay, I think the pandemic grants are ready to go into civil disobedience if there is no proposal at the end. But as Charles very eloquently put it last night, that we have to earn the right to reject the proposal that will be finally on the table. And in order to earn the right, we need to be fully engaged in the process until the very end. And that includes dialogue with Beijing. We have to engage in dialogue with Beijing. We can't be too wary of criticisms from our radical friends that we are compromising through the process of dialogue. I don't believe in that. I believe that the gulf of difference is not so wide that the two sides cannot sit together, at least to have a talk about the way forward. Now, at the end of the day, if there's no consensus, that's a different matter, but we have to try through dialogue, through negotiation, and at the very end, we still didn't get it, we'll decide then what to do. Thank you. Yes.
Hi, my name is John, and I have typically boiling down my thoughts to a single question, but mainly I'm thinking about the level of discussion here. We're talking about the state of Hong Kong, and the entity of Hong Kong and the state of China as two having opposing ideologies. But at the same time, we also see people in Hong Kong really desiring the system that we have right now. And at the same time, we also see people from China kind of desiring the way of life in Hong Kong as well. We see a large influx of people from China moving to Hong Kong. So I'm just wondering if we have been simplifying or simplistically thinking about the relations between Hong Kong and China. Perhaps the oppositions occur at one level, but not at the other level. And if you could just expound your thoughts a bit more on the relations between Hong Kong and China. Perhaps that the one country system has a new meaning for Hong Kong in the years to come, and that it's not just about economics of Hong Kong as a financial center, or about a test pilot scheme or site for thinking about China-Taiwan relations, but as a way for the Chinese government to think about how to manage the people that they have rule over.
Okay, I think that's a great question. And Larry just told me that's the last question. I really would like to take a few more if that's possible. Okay, all right. Because there are two more here. But anyway, to answer your question, John, you mentioned the influx of immigrants from China and how that's going to impact on Hong Kong. It has already generated a huge impact. In terms of politics, what you see in politics in Hong Kong now is the rise of the localism. 本土行動. And also there are very unpleasant, I would put it no less than that, very unpleasant slogans that are being chanted by some, calling our mainland immigrants locusts, and they are people who I cannot stand this. I do not accept any of it, and I would not be part of that politics, because that politics is inward-looking and is destructive. I think Hong Kong has always built its success on immigrants. My grandparents were immigrants. They came to Hong Kong to search for job opportunity, and that is what gave Hong Kong its energy. We need influx of immigrants. Of course, we should be, things are very different from back in the 50s, post-war, but we still need immigrants. And should we be a little more choosy and selective in our immigrants? Why not? Yes, we should be. But immigrants from China, I see it as a positive force for Hong Kong, if managed properly. Of course, we have a very tight housing market. We have limited resources to deal with social issues that arise from immigrants. But we need immigrants to come from all over China, because I personally have very positive experience. Of course, I speak from my experience as perhaps as a lawyer, for example, that there are many young mainland students who come to Hong Kong and study common law. They come to Hong Kong U, they do the Master of Laws, or they come to do the JD, and the experience I get from them is they are transformed by the process. They go back, sometimes some of them stay in Hong Kong to work and they love it. Some would choose to go back, but become government officials or judges, but they are forever changed through that process. So I see that interaction between Hong Kong and China is fundamental in that sense. It is beyond, as you rightly said, beyond economics considerations or simply free market considerations. I frankly am not afraid that there will be a Shanghai economic trade zone, that maybe it will become the next Hong Kong great. I'm not afraid of that because I believe Hong Kong has what it takes to take on challenges from Shanghai, from the Shanghai Free Economic Trade Zone. If we keep what we have in Hong Kong intact, namely the core values, I'm not afraid of those challenges. And I welcome interactions, more interactions with Mainland, not only in terms of its people, but also on the social, cultural, and economic side. Yes. One more.
Hi, my name is Elizabeth. I'm actually starving, so I don't want to talk too much. But I really want to make a response to that question about the relationship between core values and democracy. I think he made a really valid point in saying that. Wait, what did she say? Oh yeah, because we didn't have democracy, but still we have core values. What's the point of having democracy to safeguard core values? So I would like to say, bear in mind, our core values in Hong Kong nowadays are actually imposed by our British colonial power, like it or not, but we don't really fight for it. I mean, we don't have any revolution to fight for freedom of speech or something like that. So it's rather like imposed on us. So what is, I mean, if you just impose some values on some people, it's easier, but if you really want to maintain their values, it's really hard. So for me, I feel like democracy is I would say is the only feasible way to safeguard core values in Hong Kong. And secondly, in response to your question about democracy, of course, 民主唔係萬能嘅，即係you can never solve each and every single problems in Hong Kong nowadays simply by democracy. But also bear in mind that democracy doesn't mean that you just have the right to vote and you have the right to nominate. Democracy is like a really broad concept. It's not only like in the ballot cast. You have a lot of systems, a lot of things to complement. For example, you need a clean bureaucracy, you need an independent judiciary, you need a constitution which guarantees your individual rights and freedoms and really speculates what you can do and not. So it's like a really, a broad system. You cannot just say, oh, we have an election today, so we are democratic. So in such sense, in a broad sense, to see democracy, you can see actually core values in Hong Kong and democracy actually go hand in hand. Because what you have mentioned as our core values are actually, very complementary. So I just want, and if you really want to know more, actually you can read The Economist last week about what's gone wrong with democracy. It's a really great article how people attack democracy. And it's actually not like democracy itself. In spirit, I mean, of course it's perfect, but in practice, there are a lot of problems as well. But how you make it work, I think is the most important thing. And I really want people to focus more on how can you really make it work in Hong Kong.
Sure.
Yeah. Yeah, right. I really want to have lunch. So.
Just a very quick response for that very thoughtful question. 民主唔係萬能, of course not. Democracy is not going to solve all our problems. But I always use this analogy. If someone is sick, goes to see a doctor, and the doctor say, look, I can cure you. And he said, look, can you also help me find a girlfriend, get a job, deal with all the challenges I face in life? The doctor said, of course I cannot. I can only cure you, help you get your body fit so that you can face the challenges. And that person would say, well, then don't cure me because I don't need your help. But that's silly, isn't it? And it's like saying that Hong Kong system has fallen out of date. It cannot cope with the challenges of the 21st century. Society has become much more complicated. Our political and social problems needs a system that is much more inclusive, much more democratic in order to deal with the challenges that we face. Of course, if after we fix the system, we still have to face those challenges. How do we build an incinerator or do we continue to use landfills? That's the problem that we've been looking at in Europe last week with a delegation. So those are the kind of questions we still have to deal with, but get the system right. Get it upright, get it, as you said, make it work. And I believe Hong Kong has all the basic building blocks to have a successful democratic regime. And Hong Kong people are sensible. They are sensible. They know that you need proper campaign finance laws, that gerrymandering is not something to do, that you don't trust political parties that much, and you shouldn't have parties be too dominant in one political scene. I think Hong Kong people know that. And Hong Kong people are confident that, I think, through all those years of experience, we should be able to implement a successful democratic regime. But the last word is what you say about core values, right, and its relationship with a democratic regime. Those core values were left behind, so to speak, by a British colonial government, but not without fight on the part of the Hong Kong people. You've heard this morning the history of protests that Hong Kong people has to go through. You think the British colonial government formed the ICAC out of its own sheer goodwill? No, because the police force at the time was so corrupt that the Hong Kong people can stand it no longer, that the whole place is really going to erupt unless the British do something about it, and they did by forming the ICAC. You think the independence of the legal profession or the independence of the judiciary came about overnight because the British was there? No, the Hong Kong people built it. The Hong Kong people, through their own resourcefulness, built a strong legal profession by going out to places like Cambridge, Oxford, and at the time the best law schools in the world to bring back their knowledge and expertise. You know, one of the first ever Chinese barrister, Ping Fong, is from Hong Kong, and he subsequently became the Minister of Justice and Minister of Foreign Affairs under Dr. Sun Yat-sen's government. He's from Hong Kong. And I think Hong Kong people really should be credited for building what we have today. And that's why Hong Kong people deserve democracy, and I hope that your faith will remain with Hong Kong. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much again for traveling all the way from Hong Kong, and thank you everyone else for such challenging and thought-provoking questions. This will be Professor Wu's panel this afternoon, so feel free to ask more questions there or approach them during lunch. Lunch is going to be served by Next Door, where you guys checked in for registered delegates and speakers from 1 o'clock to 1:45. And our program begins again at 2 o'clock at the Life Sciences Center. And we'll have ushers and please have your name tags ready. And Clarence has a gift for Dennis that he'll present to them too. But thanks again for coming, and please join us later.